The internet is home to many things, both good and bad. The internet can be and has been used for many things. It is a limitless source of information and knowledge, and a creative outlet for people who want to share said creativity. The internet has also created a lot of things that didn't seem to exist before. Nowadays, if you are interested in something, you can easily find hundreds of people interested in the same thing who are willing to talk about it. I think that fact alone, the fact that no matter how obscure my interests are, there will always be people who share it, is what contributes to the amount of new things created by the internet every day. Things that didn't exist before. Things like internet aesthetics. Internet aesthetics can be many things. So many things, it's hard to stab a certain definition for what they are. They range from empty rooms, to music, to the way people dress and act. So why not just call it an aesthetic? Why add internet? Well, these forms of expression were only really popularized by the internet. Aesthetics like weirdcore can be so out there that it'd be hard to find anybody actually interested in it, in real life at least. Online, however, you can find a community of people interested in anything. The word aesthetic itself is also something to go over. Throughout most of history, the word aesthetic has been used as a noun, a branch of philosophy concerned with the study or the appreciation of beauty. However, online at least, the word is now mostly used as an adjective to describe things like images or rooms. Why is the term aesthetic even used in the first place? Clearly, it's supposed to be a stand-in for beautiful or pretty. Something that's aesthetic is much more different than something that's beautiful. The Norwegian fjords are beautiful. A city with no people snowing at night is aesthetic. So why are some things aesthetic and some aren't? What makes something aesthetic? Well, let's start with the most common types of aesthetics. The core aesthetic. Things like weirdcore, dreamcore, and traumacore are all examples of a core aesthetic. These are just the most popular ones. There are plenty of core aesthetics that simply take an everyday object and add core at the end and call it an aesthetic. So is that what an internet aesthetic is? I don't think so. I think what an aesthetic truly is something that suspends reality, whether that be a regular photo with color filters to make the image feel otherworldly, or something completely bizarre in a context you wouldn't expect it in. In a way, aesthetics like these are somewhat escape from reality. Aesthetics like Dreamcore depict an altered reality, one that feels dreamlike in its approach. It could also be outright abstract, like Weirdcore, depicting places and scenarios that don't make any sense, with accompanying text that makes the already lack of context even more confusing, with a sometimes disturbing undertone, one that isn't obvious because of a threat, but rather the lack of one. Some weirdcore images feel like they purposely withhold information far darker than we can imagine. Yet they feel like they have no grander purpose at the same time, a kind of nonsense that we find satisfying. You wouldn't really call weirdcore or dreamcore images beautiful, which is where I think the middle ground of aesthetic comes from. Then, there are the problems with defining what an aesthetic even is. Aesthetics are so broad that it's really hard to say where something stops being an aesthetic. Dressing a certain way is an aesthetic, but what else is? Would that also mean architecture is an aesthetic? If you think about it that way, brutalist architecture can be considered an aesthetic, but not everybody can agree on what constitutes the definition of aesthetic. If you look at aesthetics as simply a form of art and an expression of beauty, then anything can be considered an aesthetic because of the subjectiveness of beauty in art. However, I would personally disagree with what some people call an aesthetic, like liminal spaces. Me and many others simply find them scary and or nostalgic, but you can see how one might call them an aesthetic. Liminal spaces are pictures of places with no context or people to inhabit them. They exist as places devoid of the thing that makes them alive: people. I was originally surprised when I came across images of liminal spaces on the r/aesthetic subreddit, but looking at some liminal space images with the context of aesthetics, they kind of fit in. Another thing I find interesting about liminal spaces being used as an aesthetic is that the loneliness and the lack of people in liminal space images can reflect the feelings of abandonment felt by us, which is why I like to call liminal spaces and other images like them abandoned aesthetics. Much like traumacore, abandoned aesthetics reflects the user's trauma onto images. Liminal spaces may reflect feelings of abandonment because they themselves have been abandoned. Although, I'm probably just reading too far into it. Liminal spaces as an aesthetic does make sense, however. Many weirdcore and dreamcore images also often depict liminal spaces, along with a lot of generally accepted aesthetic photos or videos. Liminal spaces also fit the general definition of what an aesthetic is, as a place suspended in reality. Empty malls and old pools aren't really meant to be empty like this. It's only when you come at a time you're not supposed to, like at night, that it turns into a liminal space, and therefore, aesthetic. Now that we have a base for what an internet aesthetic is, we can finally start looking at some of them. The three most popular core aesthetics are weirdcore, dreamcore, and traumacore. I won't go into too much detail about weirdcore since I've already made a video about that, and traumacore is a bit dark for my channel, so for now, I'll be going over dreamcore. Dreamcore is an aesthetic that is very similar to weirdcore upon first glance, but it's different in a lot of ways. While weirdcore tries to be at least a little scary by seeming to purposely hide something disturbing, dreamcore doesn't do that. Dreamcore simply lays everything out in front of you, and more often than not, without supporting text to explain anything. As a result, some dreamcore images can simply be described as a different flavor of liminal spaces. Dreamcore itself is one thing, but there are really two types of dreamcore images. The first one tries its best to be weird, to create a false dreamlike reality that feels disturbing in a way that's hard to point out. Environments and situations one would only find themselves while dreaming. The second type of dreamcore image usually depicts some being or something that you're meant to focus on. Mostly eyes with wings for some reason. But it can also be other things. A lot of dreamcore images depict what is known as a biblically accurate angel. Biblically accurate angels are pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty much what the actual Bible describes angels to be, and it's pretty disturbing. Angels in the Bible are described as floating, eye-covered wheels that sparkle like jewels. Not usually how you imagine an angel, and it's one of the reasons that dreamcore images depict so many eyes. These two types of dreamcore images both work to give a feeling of derealization. Derealization is a feeling of detachment from reality, and that's really what you are in a dream, detached. I personally prefer the more liminal-esque dreamcore images, as, at least to me, they better depict the dreamlike qualities that the aesthetic is built on. Dreamcore can also be uniquely escapist. The popularization of dreamcore can reflect dissatisfaction with life itself, and the longing to simply exist in a dream. Dreamcore can also be nostalgic. Dreamcore images will often have saturated colors and depict familiar or almost nostalgic places. What else do you remember from your childhood that was saturated? Probably a lot of old children's cartoons. So seeing such a highly saturated image depicting a time you once knew grounds you back into your childhood, giving you a yearning for simpler times. The nostalgic aspect of dreamcore images is also reinforced by the scenarios that they depict. Places like bedrooms and playgrounds, all places that you might have visited as a child, but feel almost strange in this context. Sometimes in dreamcore images, just one or two things are off, but more often than not, in dreamcore images, reality simply doesn't make sense. It feels like it's trying to be nostalgic, but much like our own memories, it's flawed, and doesn't actually depict those experiences fully, only small glimpses of them, like a fever dream that you can only kind of remember after waking up, but the finer details are missing. Another thing of note is the music that is commonly associated with dreamcore. A lot of the dreamcore music isn't really exclusive to the aesthetic, however. The sounds of dreamcore music can also be attributed to weirdcore in the same way, which is why you'll see videos that claim to be weirdcore/dreamcore playlists instead of just one or the other. These tracks often use 8-bit OSTs from older games like Humaniki or LSD Dream Emulator. This makes these tracks nostalgic, not just to the people who played those games, but also to people who grew up with this era of gaming, with its familiar 8-bit sound effects that were a product of old technology. Only now, it's being turned into something else, something more disturbing. To help with this disturbing undertone, people will often slow and reverb these songs to make them feel more otherworldly or uncanny. It gives the feeling that something is wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it. Much like weirdcore and dreamcore images themselves. The tracks also tend to sound like the lo-fi hip-hop beats that I'm sure you're familiar with, but in a pixelated way, and one that feels more disturbing than calming. Combine this with the nostalgia and the slow reverbed versions a lot of these tracks have, and you can see why they fit the Dreamcore aesthetic perfectly. Speaking of aesthetic music, Vaporwave is another aesthetic that stands out. Vaporwave has a lot of music attached to it, and the music can be described as very aesthetic. These songs, however, also have covers and album art, depicting what most people would call the visual Vaporwave aesthetic, and that's what I'm going to talk about here. Vaporwave images often depict themes from the 80s and 90s. Pretty much anything nostalgic about those time periods are replicated in Vaporwave, especially old technology. Things like VHS tapes, old game consoles, and computers with outdated hardware are often front and center in Vaporwave, which is why VHS glitching is often used in this aesthetic. The use of old technology and general things in the 80s is nostalgic, obviously, but other things like old commercials and old anime are also used to reinforce this nostalgia. It doesn't have to be hardware either. Software like Windows 96 pop-ups are also often used in Vaporwave to make it more nostalgic to the people who grew up in those times. Another reason Vaporwave is so captivating is its color palette, focusing on pinks and blues, making Vaporwave images feel dreamlike, much like Dreamcore. It's not just the color palette that makes Vaporwave feel dreamlike either. Some Vaporwave images depict dreamlike scenarios and situations that wouldn't really make sense in the real world. Again, much like Dreamcore. These dreamlike qualities can represent a lot of things, but I think combined with nostalgia, the dreamlike aesthetics of Vaporwave act as a way to reminisce on the 80s and 90s, but not perfectly. Like I mentioned with Dreamcore, much like in a dream, certain details of Vaporwave images don't make sense. Looking at Vaporwave images feels like a blend of yearning for the past and being in a fever dream. I personally wasn't born in a time where I could see and use these old technologies, but somehow, Vaporwave still feels nostalgic. Vaporwave feels like reminiscing on your past in a dream. The weird effects that Vaporwave puts in front of you might be the result of your brain not fully remembering a dream, but it could also be interpreted as a longing for a time you hadn't ever existed in, not remembering the exact details or getting things wrong simply because you are reminiscing on a time you've never known. The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows has a word for this: anemoia, nostalgia for a time you've never known. Another thing of note that helps this dreamlike vibe created by Vaporwave is what it depicts. Liminal spaces are often depicted in Vaporwave imagery, mostly because they fit hand in hand together so well. They both share dreamlike qualities and both can be nostalgic. Even other aesthetics like poolcore fit in with Vaporwave, as liminal pools are often depicted in Vaporwave imagery, often with a changed color tone to fit the aesthetic. Malls in the 90s is another example of depictions of liminal spaces in Vaporwave, with their neon colors and nostalgic feel that perfectly match with Vaporwave. Another weirder aspect of Vaporwave is the use of Greek statues. They are used as an artistic choice in a lot of Vaporwave images. It's hard to say why though. Since I doubt that most of you are nostalgic for ancient Greece, my theory is that the aesthetic of marble Greek statues clashes so heavily with the neon 80s vibe of Vaporwave that they end up actually complementing each other, if that makes sense. Consumerism is also a big aspect in Vaporwave that's worth going over, because for a lot of people, it's one of the main things that makes Vaporwave unique from other aesthetics. The use of nostalgic brands in Vaporwave like Blockbuster or the old design of Coke and Pepsi cans. Vaporwave images can also depict large cities with almost a cyberpunk-like aesthetic, which also goes along with the idea of consumerism. Vaporwave, at its core, is a lot like Dreamcore in the way that it's hard to describe. It seems to have a more show-don't-tell way of presenting its message. You can immediately recognize a Vaporwave image, but it's much harder to describe with words what constitutes as Vaporwave. You just kind of know by looking at it. Another thing that can be thought of as an aesthetic is old anime. And by old anime, I mean the era around the 80s and 90s. You know the look. That lo-fi look with the high bloom, all animated completely by hand. Old animes like Akira are making a recovery nowadays, both in the form of aesthetics and meme culture. And older anime has been brought up a lot on the r/aesthetic subreddit. I think the love for older anime is some parts nostalgia, but I think the real reason is just how damn good it looks. Some would argue, myself included, that it looks even better than anime that comes out now. Old anime just has a certain lo-fi feel to it. It had personality. The VHS effects, the vintage glow of bright objects, it all makes it feel so original. Aesthetics can also be found in architecture. As I said earlier in the video, architecture also technically counts as an aesthetic, especially in brutalist buildings. Brutalism, as the name suggests, is brutal. These harsh buildings made entirely out of concrete, seemingly built for just function and not for looks. Brutalist can be looked at as sort of an aesthetic, one that some love and some hate, but it's hard not to see some beauty in it, despite the design going for the exact opposite, which is in stark contrast to Beaux-Arts architecture, a way more formal way of designing a building. But brutalism is still used. Brutalist architecture feels almost honest in a way. It's not a towering glass tower, nor is it a detailed complex with stained glass windows. It's simply what it was designed for, and nothing else. Brutalist structures are more or less designed to serve absolute purpose and not to look pretty, although this counts as more of an aesthetic rather than an internet aesthetic. The internet is a place of limitless learning and creativity, and nothing says that better than these aesthetics. When a group of so many people can come together on pretty much anything, truly great things can come out of it. I think internet aesthetics themselves are a natural evolution of art, much like Surrealism was in the 20s and 30s. And with the vast amount of people coming together to make these aesthetics, new ones are being created all the time, a lot of which depict nostalgia, especially with liminal spaces. I found that older people don't really understand these aesthetics as much, and I think there's good reason behind this. A lot of these aesthetics have the main appeal of nostalgia, and if you weren't born in the 90s to the late 2000s, I bet a lot of these aesthetics wouldn't work as well for you. So it isn't universal. But even then, to the people that can appreciate these aesthetics, they truly are something else. I really think that the pandemic had a lot to do with this. I don't think as many of these communities would exist without the pandemic locking everybody inside their homes. And with the world changing so drastically and all the problems we have, it might be good sometimes to look back on the good old days. The simpler times, when we were all young and naive. A sort of collective mindset of longing for the past being visualized by these aesthetics. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't appreciate right now. In 2040, maybe we'll have new aesthetics, or even more advanced art forms that play off of nostalgia for the 2020s, saying how much of a simpler time that was. So appreciate right now, because you'll never experience it in the same way ever again.